How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. This is the Trapper, a new character mini from my tabletop RPG. And here she is at the in-game playable scale of 28mm. Today I'm going to be using her to make a diorama about a hunter and their prey. And I'm honestly not sure which is which. The first thing to do for this diorama was to prep a base for our miniatures to stand on. I've run out of large XPS foam pieces, which is why I've mostly been using scraps for my builds recently. I'm trying to work all the way through my leftovers before stocking up on more. The monster in today's build is a Badlands Sasquatch, one of the first monster ideas that I had from the Wild Imaginary West. And if you're not familiar with the Badlands, they're a wild area of otherworldly rock formations in South Dakota. This Sasquatch uses the labyrinth of rock as its lair, and I'll give more background on that later in the video. My challenge here was to arrange this random assortment of foam scraps into a convincing section of rocks that you'd find in the Badlands. I first had to isolate some scraps that were large enough to cover the base when combined, which I was able to do with 3 pieces. The next step was to cut them out to match the shape of the oval base. After gluing those in place, I then broke out my hot wire and began carving the foam away to create a slope from one side of the base to the other. Because as we know, sloped things provide more of an emotional response than level things, for better or for worse. Once a decent amount of volume had been removed from the base, I glued the basis of the vertical rock formation in place, and then brought back my hot wire and cut out the vertical wedges. The goal here was to recreate the exaggerated spiky sections of the rocks that you'd find in the Badlands. Once the main shapes were all cut out, I glued one more rock on, and then I dremeled in the rest of the detail using my stylo wren. I vacuumed up all the foam dust and wore a respirator while I was doing this to prevent myself from getting the pink lung. Usually, I would do as much as I could to prevent the lines between the foam layers from being noticeable, but in the reference photos, the layers of the rocks are very much visible, so in this case I didn't have to worry about it. A little bit of heat from the torch got rid of the fuzzies and gave the rocks a slightly smoother surface, and with that done I could slap on some gloves and add some texture and protection to these rocks and to the ground. I mixed up plaster, paint, Mod Podge, and a sprinkling of sculpt mold to create a thick little paste that I could use to cover the ground and build it up smoothly against the rocks. And to finish the job of smoothing, I used some isopropyl alcohol and my gloved hand, and that did the trick. The next step was to protect the remaining pink foam using some Mod Podge and black paint. Mod Podge dries clear, so the black paint helps ensure full coverage. I set that aside to dry and then moved over to the minis, and it was time to paint. I glued them to some bases using a tiny bead of superglue, which will be easy to remove later on. In case you didn't see it, Dan made a wonderful diorama using this same Badlands Sasquatch that I sent to him, but unfortunately he broke the toes off because it was superglued a little too strongly to the base. Go check out that video if you haven't seen it. It's great. After priming the minis, I began layering on the base coats, and while I paint these, I'd like to give the backstory for the diorama as well as give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. Like I mentioned at the beginning, these 2 minis are the Trapper and the Badlands Sasquatch. The Trapper was drawn to the Badlands by the stories of this legendary creature. One of the oldest stories from my Wild Imaginary West, actually. The story goes that he went on a murderous rampage among his own kind, and was banished from his troop that lives in the Black Hills and has wandered down into the rocky wasteland and has made that his new domain. The Trapper has been tracking the movements of the monster for multiple days, trying to get close enough to land a perfect shot while also avoiding being eaten. He's more than aware of her presence, and he's not very happy about being the one being followed through the Badlands for once. Last night it snowed, so the Trapper's scent is more easy to follow, and the Sasquatch is closing in. She's made a little decoy out of her jacket, which hopefully he goes to instead of her. She wouldn't have preferred the hunt to be rushed like this, but the end is almost near, and it's do or die. With the minis done and the Mod Podge dry, I brought back the base and primed it as well. After that, I began layering up all of the colors represented in the rocks of the Badlands, starting with the darkest, getting lighter and lighter as I went, adding additional glazes of color as they were necessary. I then finally switched to a pure white to establish a frosty look over the rocks and over the whole base, and I built up a gradient along the bottom of the rocks where light from the sun would have hit the snow and bounced up onto them. May not look very good right now, but after the snow is on, I think it's pretty convincing. And speaking of snow, the next step was to mix some up using some snow powder from Woodland Scenics and some Mod Podge. And honestly, when I was done mixing it, the consistency looked a lot like homemade vanilla ice cream. I started with a palette knife and switched to my finger to apply the rest of the snow to the base. I made sure to also tickle the tops of the rocks with a bit of the snow, and then finally sprinkled a little bit of loose snow over everything for good measure. While the Mod Podge was still wet, I decided to put the minis in place. This will help them look like they're in the snow and not on the snow. It'll also hold them tightly in place when it's dry. I did use a pin in the foot of the Sasquatch for good measure, and when he was in place, I used the knife again to add some footprints behind him. And of course, the last thing to do before this diorama was done was to paint the rim with black 4.0. After that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please be sure to check out the art challenge submissions from all of my patrons. The theme of October and November was monster encounters in the wild imaginary West. Huge thank you to all the patrons who participated. As of the release of this video, there are 30 more days to enter the Crafting for Hope fundraiser art challenge, which is organized by PKT Crafts and judged by Miscast, Craftsman, Jazza, and myself. All the money raised will go toward child cancer research through St. Jude Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Hero Forge has also kindly joined with Crafting for Hope to provide the prizes for all of the winners of the different categories. I use Hero Forge all the time, really love what they do. These prizes are pretty awesome. The art challenge will be linked below, and there's still time to participate. You definitely should if you can. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.